Good morning. Why don't you go ahead and grab the refreshments, and then we're going to go ahead and get started. If you haven't been here for the last couple of weeks, I'm Peter Vogt. I'm the Dean of Bethel Seminary, and this is week 3 of our look at Deuteronomy's vision in the Christian church. So I'm glad that you're here this morning and really excited about sharing with you some further thoughts about the book of Deuteronomy. So let's begin with a word of prayer, and then we'll jump in. Father, we thank you for this beautiful Sunday morning. We thank you for the fellowship that we can have. Thank you, Lord, that you gather your people together. And we pray, Lord, that you would bless this time. Strengthen us in our walk with you as a result of the fellowship that we experience, as a result of thinking and engaging with your word, worshiping you as a community. All those things, Lord, use it to shape us and form us and help us to be more the people you call us to be. Lord, we ask that as we continue our study of Deuteronomy this morning, that you would bless our time, that you would touch our hearts and use your word to challenge us, to sharpen us, to shape us in important ways. We invite you to make your presence felt powerfully through your Spirit this morning. We dedicate this time to you, Lord. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Well, so for the last few weeks, we've been taking a look at Deuteronomy's vision in the Christian church coming out of the wilderness. And we have been talking a little bit about how the parallels between the situation of the people that Moses is addressing in the book of Deuteronomy and our situation in the United States, feeling like we're coming out of the wilderness in some respects, whether it's in terms of the pandemic and some of the changes that are there. And some of the similarities are in the fact that as the Israelites go into the land, they are encountering a people and a culture that is not terribly welcoming of them. And we too find ourselves in the midst of a culture where we're not always welcome, and our perspectives are not always the most welcome perspectives. And how do we live in light of that? And Moses, as the people are gathered on what I call the back door to the promised land, as they're the second generation of Israelites to have that came out of Egypt, they're gathered on at the back door to the promised land. They're where their parents were 38 years earlier, and they're faced with a choice. Are they going to make the same choice their parents did, which was to resist, to reject what God was calling them to rebel, and not go in and take the land, or are they going to go in and take the land? And Moses is addressing this generation, encouraging them, obviously, to obey God and to take the land as he called them to. But he's giving them this advice, exhorting them in important ways, because he's not going with them. And he's not going to be able to go into the land himself. So this is Moses' last best chance to tell the people the things that they need to know in order to live as the people of God. And so that's where we pick up the story. We've been looking at different aspects of Deuteronomy's vision and how that's relevant for us. So we talked about the supremacy of Yahweh as the first aspect of the Deuteronomy's vision, that they have to get set in their minds and in their lives the idea that Yahweh alone can be their God. There can be no other gods besides God. And they have to live as if that's true. Not just mentally acknowledge that, but they have to live as if that's true. And everything else flows from that awareness. The idea of the supremacy of God. All these other aspects of Deuteronomy's vision flow from the idea that there is one God, and that is Yahweh, the God of Israel. And then we talked about the religious significance of all of life. And that's what we did last week. We talked about the fact that for the Israelites, and from the perspective of Deuteronomy and the Old Testament as a whole, every minute of every day is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to show loyalty to God or to show disloyalty to God. And there is no middle ground. There's no neutral territory from an Old Testament perspective. There's no part of life that doesn't matter to God. And so they need to live as the people of God in every way. And so we talked about the Torah and some of the legal material and how it regulates the food that they eat, the clothes they wear, how they treat other people, all these sorts of things. That's part of living as the people of God. And I stressed that we sometimes have a misconception that the rules, the instruction that God gives in the Torah are a way of earning salvation. And I said that's a misconception. It was never about that. And it's about living as the people of God, living out relationship with God. And so that means we can look at these instructions in a little bit of a different way. We don't have to see them as, well, that's an old way of relating to God, and a checklist and a scorecard that we don't need to care about anymore. Because it was never that, we can look at it in much the same way. And we can look at it and say, what can we learn about how to live as the people of God in our setting, recognizing that it's a very different kind of a setting, not least because of Jesus and his ministry, which we're going to be talking about here in just a little bit. So that brings us to today. We're going to talk about the third aspect of Deuteronomy's vision. And that is that the people of Israel are the people of Yahweh. The people of Israel are the people of Yahweh. Now this may seem very obvious, and in some ways it is. If Yahweh is supreme and they're his people, then obviously they're the people of Yahweh. But there are implications of this that Moses is seeking to highlight for the people and what that means. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at this. We can take a look at a passage like Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 6 through 8. It says, "For you are a people holy to Yahweh your God. Yahweh your God has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. It was not because you were more in number than any other people that Yahweh set his love on you and chose you, for you were the fewest of all peoples. But it is because Yahweh loves you and is keeping the oath that he swore to your fathers, that Yahweh has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt." So Moses is reminding the people that they are the people of God, not because of any strength or attribute or anything on their part. They are the people of God because God chose them to be the people of God. And he highlights, he says, you were not more in number than any other people. You were the fewest of all peoples. They're not a large people group. And yet God chose them to be his people, to be his treasured possession. And here again, we sometimes have a popular conception that the Israelites were chosen as the chosen people, that they can just do whatever they want, and it doesn't matter what happens. The rest of the world, God doesn't care about. Again, that is not an accurate understanding of what the Bible teaches. While it's a popular idea, that's not a biblical idea. That being in the chosen people means that the Israelites can just do whatever they want, they can just live however they want, or that God doesn't care about all the peoples on earth. And we'll explore that in a minute here. So he chooses the Israelites, and Moses is reminding the people, his audience in Deuteronomy, that God chose them to be his treasured possession out of all the people. And they have a special role to play. And it says, notice in verse 8, why it was that he chose them. It's not because they're the most numerous. And by the way, I don't have a slide for it, but it's also not because they were so great. Okay? It's like that they were so exceptionally righteous or anything. In fact, in Deuteronomy 9, it says, you are a stubborn and stiff-necked people. That's not exactly a compliment, right? It's not, you guys are so awesome, you're stubborn and stiff-necked, and that's why I chose you. He says, no, you're not that great. You are a stubborn and stiff-necked people. You don't deserve the role that God has given you, which is true. And of course, that's true for us as well. We don't deserve the role that God has given us. But it's not because they were more in number. It's not because they were more righteous than other people. It's because, according to verse 8, Yahweh loves you and is keeping the oath that he swore to your fathers. Now, for us, as we read that today, we might say, well, what's that, the oath sworn to the fathers? For the Israelites, that had important meaning. They understood immediately what God was saying through Moses to them. Because the oath sworn to the fathers, that's supposed to be an arrow there, sorry about that. The oath sworn to the fathers is the call of Abram. Okay? So we got to go back a little bit to the book of Genesis to understand what is going on. In Genesis chapter 12, it says, Yahweh had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So this is the beginning of God's choice, his election of Israel. And we note that Genesis 12 comes on the heels of the description of the fall in Genesis chapter 3, and then the consequences in Genesis chapters 4 through 11. So we have in Genesis the account of creation, and creation is good. It's the way God wants it to be. Genesis 1:31, God saw all that he had made, and it was perfect. In Hebrew, that's a better translation than just very good. It was perfect. It was exactly as God intended for it to be. And then chapter 2, of course, focuses in on the creation of humanity. And then we have Genesis chapter 3. And things go off the rails at that point, because human beings, though created in the image of God, more like God than any creature that God made, nevertheless want more. They want equality with God. And they're envisioning a reality where they can be co-equal with God. You've got God here and humans here. You can't hold the mic and get that up there. But two equals there, which of course can never be. That human beings can never be equals with God. And so the result was greater separation from God. And there's enmity between humans and creation. There's enmity between humans and God. And God pronounces a curse on the ground and on the created order in many respects. Now, if that was the end of the story, that would be a sad story. But thankfully, it's not the end of the story. Because God is a God of grace, and he doesn't simply kill Adam and Eve and say, he certainly would have been justified in doing that, right? I mean, they're seeking to usurp his place, to take his place. They had been given this great privilege of being his image bearers, his representatives in the created order, and yet they abused that privilege. And so God would have certainly been justified in saying, well, you deserve the death penalty over that. You're seeking to dethrone the king. And so by doing that, God certainly would have been justified. And that would have been the end. And he doesn't just walk away from it and say, well, that was a failed experiment, and that didn't work, let's do something else now. Instead, he continues to relate to fallen humanity. And he promises that there's going to be redemption, even in Genesis chapter 3, in the beginning. Chapters 4 through 11 start talking about the consequences of the fall, where there's the first murder that takes place. And you see the increasing depravity of human beings as they rebel against God, and the fruits of their rebellion start to be felt in the world. And in Genesis 4 through 11, there's a repeated cycle where there's a description of the sin of humanity and a gracious response on the part of God. So in Genesis chapter 6, for example, you have the account where it says that the inclinations of human beings was only evil all the time. Not a very positive description of human beings. And so God executes judgment. He says, I'm going to send a flood to judge these people. But there's an act of grace in there that Noah and his family are spared. He doesn't wipe all humanity out. And so there's the constant sort of back and forth between the increasing depravity of human beings and then God's grace. What we find in towards the end of that cycle, that you've got the depravity of human beings in the Tower of Babel incident, where human beings once again rebel against God. They refuse to fill the earth. Remember, God, before the fall, when he gives his charge to Adam and Eve, he says, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. And so he's envisioning humanity spread out over the face of earth. And an earth teeming with human life is a good thing in God's mind. And yet human beings in the Tower of Babel incident say, you know what? If we're not careful, we're going to be spread out over all the earth. Which is exactly what God said he wanted for them. But they say, let's work together, and we gather here, and we'll build a tower with its top in the heavens. And their efforts are so insignificant, God has to come down to see it, and he says, this isn't going to stand. And so he confuses their language and scatters them all over the earth so that they're exactly where he intended for them to be. But there's not the positive story after that. The positive story is in Genesis chapter 12. Because up until this point in Genesis, God has been responding to human actions. Now, I don't mean that he doesn't know what's going to happen before it happens, but in the way the story is described for us, he's responding to the things that human beings are doing. In Genesis chapter 12, God takes the initiative and says, I'm going to fix this. I'm going to fix this thing. And he chooses Abram, as we see in what's on the screen. And he chooses Abram, he says, I'm going to make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So this is the beginning of God's restoration project. I wrote a book on the interpretation of the Pentateuch, and after that I wrote that book, I came up with, think of it as Extreme Makeover Universe Edition. I wish I had had that for the book. But that's in a sense what God is working on, an extreme makeover of the universe. And he's going to accomplish it. And he's going to restore things. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So Abram is being chosen as the human means by which God is going to restore creation. The human means by which God is going to fix the mess that human beings had made of everything. And it starts in Genesis chapter 12. I highlight this because it's important that we understand that the whole project of redemption, the whole project of restoration and fixing creation doesn't start in Matthew chapter 1, okay, in the New Testament. It starts in Genesis chapter 12 at the latest. It probably starts in Genesis chapter 3 at the time of the fall. And then, of course, in the mind of God, it's forever. I mean, he's always done that. But just from a biblical perspective, all the way back in Genesis. And so God chooses Abram to be the human means by which he's going to restore creation. All families on earth, all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. And then that promise gets unfolded. It starts with Abram, and it's passed on to Isaac, and then to Jacob. And this is the establishment of Israel as the people who will be that human agency. I want to talk a little bit about the choice of Abram, because this is relevant to what Moses was saying back in Deuteronomy that we were just looking at before. We sometimes have the idea that Abram, of course, his name later changed to Abraham, that he's this paragon of virtue, and maybe he was, God chose him because he was so loyal to Yahweh, a follower of God from the very beginning. Actually, that's not true, and the Bible makes that clear. In Joshua chapter 24, so much later than, well, a little bit later anyway, than Deuteronomy, when Joshua is now speaking to the people in the land at the end of the book of Joshua. It says in Joshua 24, verses 2 and 3, Joshua said to all the people, "This is what Yahweh, the God of Israel, says. Long ago your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham and Nahor, lived in the Euphrates, beyond the Euphrates River and worshipped other gods. But I took your father Abraham from the land beyond the Euphrates and led him throughout Canaan and gave him many descendants. So, long ago your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham, and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates River and worshiped other gods. So they're not loyal Yahweh worshipers. They're worshiping the gods of Mesopotamia. People like, gods like Marduk, you might have heard that name at various points, and other Mesopotamian gods. And in this culture, it would not be possible for Abraham to go against his father. He worshiped the gods his father worshipped. In fact, that's the point of Joshua 24, because the passage that is probably most familiar to us from Joshua 24 is when Joshua says, "As for me and my house, we will serve Yahweh," right? And when Joshua says that in Joshua 24, "As for me and my house, we're going to serve Yahweh," he's speaking for himself, for his wife, for his grown sons and their wives and their children, for any single daughters who were still living there. He's the patriarch, and he's speaking on behalf of that whole house, not just himself or his wife or that, but he's a patriarch, and so he's speaking for all of them. He says, "As for me and my house, we will follow Yahweh." And he doesn't poll them. He doesn't say, "Well, we're going to do this, but whatever you want to do is fine." What he decides is what the people, the family, will do. So the same is true in this culture for Terah, the father of Abraham. When he worships Marduk, or whatever Mesopotamian god he's worshiping, Abraham has to worship that god too. And so he's Abraham. Now, we don't know how sincere he was in that. The Bible doesn't tell us anything about that. But he was certainly an active participant in the worship of these other gods. There's actually a Jewish story called the Testament of Abraham. It's not part of our Bibles, but it maintains that Abraham growing up was refusing to follow his father and do these things. That he was this Yahweh worshiper from the time he was very little. And there's a reason why the Testament of Abraham is not in our Bibles, because it's not true. And the Jews rejected that story. They understood that that's contrary to the account that we have in the Old Testament of this, that Abraham was, as a son of his father Terah, worshiping other gods. So you have this sense in Genesis 12 that God chooses Abraham for reasons that are known only to God. In other words, there's nothing that says that he's a loyal Yahweh worshiper, nothing favorable about Abram. It's almost as if you get the impression that God looks around and says, you. And he picks Abram. And he says, "I'm going to restore all of creation through you." An unlikely candidate for success, not just because of his age. We know that he's 75 years old at this point, and he has no children at this point, but also because he comes from a family of idol worshipers. And yet from this family of idol worshipers, he's going to restore all of creation. And I think that's intentional because he wants for the people to understand that this is God's action, not theirs. They are tools in his hands. They aren't the instigators of this. They're not the strategists. They don't get to decide how it's all going to work. They do what God tells them to do. They're tools in his hand. And that's what the establishment of Israel means, and what Moses is reminding the people about in the book of Deuteronomy, when he says that it wasn't because you were more numerous than other peoples, but because God loves you and because of the oath sworn to your fathers. That he said in Genesis 12 that I'm going to bless all peoples on earth through you, speaking to Abram. And then that gets passed on to Isaac and to Jacob. So they're the human means by which God is going to restore creation. And what this further means is that they have a mission. They have a role to play in the world. And if we go back, all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. We need to remember that Israel exists to be a blessing. They're blessed to be a blessing. And in fact, one way you can helpfully read as you're reading through the book of Genesis, you can read through and ask yourself, how blessed, actually not just Genesis, the whole Old Testament really, but especially in Genesis, but you can ask yourself the question, how blessed are the people around Israel, how blessed are they being at the presence of Israel at this given moment? And when they're not being a blessing, they experience judgment because they are meant to be a blessing. God's desire is to bless all peoples. Remember, all human beings are created in God's image. And so God cares about all people. The election of Israel, the choice of Israel, setting them apart, giving them this special status as his treasured possession, is for the sake of the nations. It's not for Israel's sake, ultimately, they get blessed, but it's for the sake of blessing the nations around them and blessing all of humanity. So Israel has a mission to play. Missions is not a New Testament idea, it's an Old Testament idea. And I was glad to hear that is probably not new to you because it was mentioned in the sermon just last Sunday that missions is not a New Testament idea. But for Israel, they have a particular role to play. They are called, as we've seen, they're set apart from the nations. They're given the instructions of Torah that we looked at last week, a way of living so as to be different from the nations around them. And they are established in this way to be a witness to the nations of what it means to be human in relationship with God. Now, the people of God in the Old Testament, we can recognize that all humanity can be divided into two categories, right? There are Israelites and there's everybody else. Now, those are not the same size categories, but nevertheless, every human being that has ever lived fits into one of those two categories. And so there's the Israelites and there's everybody else, and they're referred to as Gentiles or the nations in the Old Testament. And so Israel is set apart as the people of God, the treasured possession, set apart from the Gentiles. And they're called to live in a certain way, to live as an example, as a witness. We talked about this last week a little bit too. That's part of what Torah is about. It's to remind the Israelites of who they are, so that, remember we said they eat as Israelites. They get dressed as Israelites. But they also make court decisions as Israelites. They care for the marginalized groups in their society as the people of God. And so they exist to be a witness of something different. Now we know that the people of God can be, the people of Israel, rather, the people of God, not every Israelite was a faithful follower of Yahweh, right? Not every Israelite, simply by being an ethnic descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, means that they are automatically doing a fantastic job at living as the people of God. And so there's a subset of the people of God. And this subset are people who are dedicated to God. And the Old Testament uses language like the remnant, understanding that not everybody falls into that category. So the Old Testament talks about a remnant, and these are people who are dedicated to God. The New Testament would use language, this isn't used in the Old Testament very much, but the New Testament would use language like saved. These are the saved people, that not every Israelite is a faithful follower of God, but there are some who are. And so that's the small subset here. And those are also described as the people of God. So we got to keep track in our minds that when the Old Testament talks about the people of God, it's using it in a couple of different ways. It can be referring to just the people of God as not Gentiles, so just an ethnic description of the Israelites, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But it can also be referring to them as the people of God in this subset. And I'll probably use a very technical term to refer to this group. I'm going to call them the people of God in the small oval sense. Is that too technical to use? The people of God in the small oval sense, the people who are faithful followers of God. But Israel's mission the challenge for all Israelites, whether they live it out or not, is to live differently, is to live in such a way as to be a witness. And through that witness, to extend God's invitation to all people to come and to be a part of the community of the people of God in the small oval sense. In other words, God's not inviting people to become Israelites and change their DNA. He's inviting them to become the people of God, part of the community of the people of God, and live in relationship with Him. And so how do they do that? How do they do that in an Old Testament perspective? Well, they do that by becoming functionally Israelite. They can't become ethnically Israelite. As we said, they can't change their DNA, and all of a sudden people who are not descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob can suddenly be said they are descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But they become functionally Israelite, because Israel has the things, the symbols that God has given that mark the community of the people of God. Things like Torah that we talked about last week, those instructions that He gave. And remember we said that those instructions are a blessing. They're a gift of grace for the people because they don't have to figure it out themselves. They don't have to say to themselves, well, man, this matters. How we live matters, and we have to honor God in all these ways. And He's not like the gods of the people around us, so we have to live in a certain way. How are we going to figure this out? They don't have to muddle through on their own. God says, here's how you're going to live. You're going to live in this way. So they have Torah. They have this instruction as to how to live as the people of God. They have the temple, the place of sacrifice. And this is the place where the people come and they offer their sacrifices to God as this sort of legal fiction. Because as we know, an animal is not a good substitute for a human being. This is where Leviticus 17:11 is an important passage. I don't have a slide for this, but if you want to just quick jump to the book of Leviticus, and you have a Bible, in Leviticus chapter 17, verse 11, is a verse that I'm going to go out on a limb and suggest probably nobody has ever thought of as being very important for your Christian life, and yet I would suggest it's very important for understanding what God is up to in all that He has established. So in Leviticus 17:11 it says, "For the life of every living thing is in the blood. So I myself have assigned it to you on the altar to make atonement for your lives, for the blood makes atonement by means of the life." Now again, you probably never thought about this as a significant verse, but why it's significant is because it indicates that God gives the sacrificial system as a way of substituting for human beings. In other words, we know, according to Paul, when he says, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, right? Now that's an Old Testament quote, actually, that talks about all have sinned in the Old Testament. So everybody sins. Everybody falls short of what God demands. And so if there's no way of dealing with that sin, what's the fate of every human being? Death, hell, separation from God, right? So that, apart from God's intervention, that's what human beings have to look forward to. But God says in Leviticus 17:11 that He says, "I myself have given you animal sacrifice as a way of substituting for human beings." Now, an animal is a terrible substitute for a human being, right? If I am an Israelite in the Old Testament period, and I've got my sheep, and I lay my hand on the sheep, which is part of the ritual. The best understanding, by the way, is that I'm the one who's supposed to draw the knife and kill the animal myself, as a way of saying what's about to happen to this animal should be happening to me. So I kill an animal, and yet that animal's innocent, right? The sheep didn't do anything wrong, and even if it didn't do it, I mean, even if that factor, what's my relationship to the sheep, right? I bought it, or I bought its mother, and it was born. I mean, that's not a close personal relationship with that sheep. It's not like it's a a family member or something like that. So this is a legal fiction. God establishes a legal fiction that says because he's a God of grace, he's going to accept an animal as a substitute for a human being. But it's a bad substitute, and everybody understands that. And so from an Old Testament perspective, the worshipers would come and they would offer their sacrifices, and of course I'm paraphrasing here, but they would say, in their minds, I think, they would say, okay, I'm offering this sacrifice, my sin is somehow being taken care of by this, and God is a God of justice, and so there's a problem, right? Because still justice hasn't been done. I've sinned, but I haven't been punished. There have been no consequences to me other than that I lost the sheep that I bought or whatever. And so they say, somehow God will make it right. And they understood that this is legal fiction, that somehow God is going to make everything right. And they trusted in that. Well, the somehow God will make it right is Jesus. Jesus on the cross. So they're looking forward to Jesus, though they don't know it at various points. Sometimes they understand they're looking forward to Messiah and all that. But when the law is given by Moses to the people and he establishes the sacrificial system, they don't know what that's going to look like. They don't understand it, but they understand, okay, God has given us a great gift. He's given us a gift, and where God says in Leviticus 17:11, I myself have given you this gift. I myself have given you this gift of a substitute. See, it's not that there's something magical about an animal blood that somehow prevents God from being able to punish or something like that. It's not like, God says, this person is deserving of consequences or punishment for that behavior. I'm going to deal with, animal blood. I can't do it now. There's nothing magical about that. He says that he's going to accept that. That's a gift. The sacrificial system is a gift of grace from God. And so I say all this because we need to understand that that's given to Israel. That sacrificial system is given to Israel. That's the temple. That's the whole of the sacrificial system that gives a way, a sort of temporary or legal fiction sort of a way of dealing with sin that will ultimately be dealt with later on, even if they don't understand it. And they have priesthood, all these sorts of things. So the Gentiles come into the community of the people of God where they can avail themselves of all the things that God has given to the Israelites by becoming functionally Israelite. So they start offering sacrifices. They start adhering to Torah. They don't wear clothing made of two types of fabric. They don't eat non-kosher foods because they want to be reminded in the same way that the Israelites do of what God is up to in the world, and that there is a division between humanity, not because those other people are bad, and of course for those coming in, there are those other people, not because they're bad, but because God wants Israel set apart for the sake of the nations and to bless them. So they become functionally Israelite and identify with the Israelites in that way. And that's God's intention. That's God's mission for Israel. That's Old Testament missions, is to build a community that is different from the communities around them, and in that way to be attractive to the nations so that they will come in and want to be a part of that community. And it does happen. We mentioned last week, Ruth is the best example of this. She's a Moabite, a non-ethnic Israelite, who comes into the community of the people of God because she becomes a follower of Yahweh because of the example of her husband's family, especially Naomi. And so she becomes a follower of Yahweh. And in that famous passage in chapter 1, verses 16 through 18, where she says to Naomi, don't send me away from you. Don't tell me to stop from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you sleep, I will sleep. And then there's a change in the Hebrew, and it says, your people are my people, your God is my God. Not your God will be my God, but your God is my God. And that's precisely why she can't do what Naomi told her to do, which is to go home to her people, because just prior to that passage she says, go back to your people, your family, and your gods. And that's the exact thing that Ruth can't do, because she's become a follower of Yahweh. And because she's become a follower of Yahweh, she's come into this people of God in the small oval sense. She needs to stay with the Israelites and become functionally Israelite. And so she's brought into the community. She's counted as an Israelite, essentially, even though she's a Moabite. And there are other examples. Rahab is another example of a Canaanite who comes into the community of the people of God and is counted among the people of God, even though from their ethnicity they're not descendants of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. But that was the mission that Israel was given. And this is what Moses is reminding the people of, that they are part of that. They are the people of Yahweh. They are a people with a mission. And they have to live a certain way so that the people will want to come in. Now, we're going to jump ahead a little bit because I want to explain a little bit of what happens, because we know that this is not the end of the story. Israel doesn't do terribly well at being the people of God. They started to think that it was about them. And by the way, I just want to add, we would do the same, okay? I don't think there's anything, no special flaws on Israel's part. I think any people group that God had chosen for this would have the same problem, would start to think that it's about them. So the Israelites start to think that it's about them. They establish their community, and they're not thinking about the nations for the most part. Sometimes they do. But you have the remnant who's doing this, but others are not. And of course, that's not a surprise to God. He knew that that's what would happen. And so what we have is a situation where God comes and, according to Isaiah chapter 57, it says God was appalled that there was no one to intervene on behalf of the nations. And so he says, I'll do it myself. And so he does. And so Jesus comes, and Jesus redefines the people of God around himself. So, now obviously this is not in the book of Deuteronomy. We're getting ahead of ourselves, but I want you to understand, as we think about today, how this applies to us. Jesus comes and he redefines the people of God around himself. So we still have Jews, or Israelites, whatever, and Gentiles in the big circle kind of a sense, that ethnic division between the two. What happens is Jesus comes along and he says that he redefines the people of God around himself. And he says, in effect, that if anyone wants to be a part of the community of the people of God in the small oval sense, okay, remember that's the saved sense, that not just an outward expression, but the inward reality of being saved in relationship with God. If anybody wants to become a part of the community of the people of God in the small oval sense, they need to identify not with Israel, but with Jesus. So, instead of identifying with Israel because they had Torah, temple, priesthood, kingship, land, all those sorts of things, everybody who wants to become part of the community of people of God needs to identify with Jesus, whether they're ethnic Jews or whether they're ethnic Gentiles. Because Jesus is the fulfillment of all of those things. He's the fulfillment of the sacrificial system, right? Because he is a good substitute for us. He is sinless in terms of his own culpability, so he has no he doesn't deserve to be crucified. He doesn't deserve death. But it can be a substitute for us. But we can also have a relationship with him. So when we enter into a relationship with him, it's like when I got married, my wife's debts became mine, and her assets became mine, and vice versa. Well, the same thing is true with respect to Jesus. When we enter into a relationship with him, our debts become his, and his assets become ours, and his debts become ours. But he doesn't have any debts. That's the good thing. And his assets are infinite. So we get a really good deal in this whole thing. But this is where the objective moment of salvation takes place, is Jesus' death on the cross. Remember I said that the Jews were looking forward to a time when God somehow would make it right. Well, the somehow making it right is the cross. when Jesus does that in a real substitution for us, a perfect substitution for us in that regard. So he's the fulfillment of the sacrificial system. Christianity is still a sacrificial religion. Sacrifice is a part of our faith. It's just not happening on a regular basis with animals. It took place once for all for us as the fulfillment of that, the filling out of the Old Testament sacrificial system. Jesus is the fulfillment of kingship. So God says to David that he's going to always reign on the throne. There will always be a descendant of David reigning on the throne. Well, did God keep that promise? Yes, because Jesus is a descendant of David and is sitting on the throne. But it doesn't look like kingship as it did in David's day. It's much bigger than that. It's a filling out of that. God gives land to the Israelites and says, this is going to be your territory. Jesus, in the fulfillment of that, says, no, it's not this little corner of the Eastern Mediterranean. It's the whole earth. It's the whole universe. And so he is the fulfillment of all of those things. And so if anybody wants to come into the community of the people of God and be a part of what God is up to, they need to identify with Jesus. And this is why, if you notice, and this is on your handout as well, but we notice that when we're talking about in the Old Testament, when Gentiles are invited in to identify with the people of God and become functionally Israelite, you notice there's still a distinction between Jew and Gentile. You see how that line is not gone. Because in the Torah, it still talks about certain things that are for Israelites, certain things that are for the Gentiles. Not many things are forbidden to the Gentiles. But nevertheless, there are still some distinctions. You can charge interest to a foreigner who is borrowing money. It's a way of, in a sense, kind of highlighting the significance of Israel. But when we look at Jesus' redefinition of the people of God, we see that line is eliminated. And that's because that distinction no longer matters. Remember we said last week that distinction was about being a witness, being set apart, which is what the word holy means. And so the Israelites are set apart to be a witness. And when Jesus redefines the people of God around himself, he's the one who's set apart. He's the one who is set apart. And so the distinction that matters is no longer Jew and Gentile, but it's follower of Jesus and non-follower of Jesus. That's the distinction of humanity that matters after Jesus. And this, by the way, is why we have the fulfillment of the food laws in the Old Testament. Remember we said last week that the food laws are about people, not food, if you were here? And so the food laws are an object lesson. They're a reminder to the Israelites of who they are as the people of God, so they eat as Israelites. And it's just an object lesson. It's a reminder. It's not about hygiene. It's not about healthy versus non-healthy or good versus bad. It's simply an object lesson. And it's about people, not food. In Mark chapter 7, it says that Jesus declares all foods clean. And so there's no longer that distinction between clean and unclean foods. Well, how is it that he can do that? It's not the case that suddenly there's some advances in food preservation that took place from Moses to Jesus. It's because the food laws are about people, not food, as I said, and Jesus eliminates the distinction between Jew and Gentile. Now, he doesn't eliminate it in the sense that it goes away. He doesn't eliminate it in the sense that it doesn't matter in terms of culture and how people live, but it goes away in terms of the plan of salvation and how one gets into relationship with God and what God is up to. And as I said then, the distinction after Jesus is between follower of Jesus and non-follower of Jesus. And so the food laws were pointing to a reality that doesn't exist after Jesus, because he has redefined the people of God around himself, so that everybody has to identify with Jesus coming into about establishing this identity of the Israelites as the people of God, with this conception of mission, with this conception of how they're supposed to live and why they're supposed to be different, and all of these sorts of things. And Moses is calling the people to remember that they are the people of God. They have a mission. They have an obligation to the people around them because of the blessing that they've been given. Not through any benefit, not through any righteousness, goodness on their part, but because God chose Abram, and they're the descendants of that. So in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 14 through 20, it says, "When you come to the land that Yahweh your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. You may indeed set a king over you, whom Yahweh your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses. Since Yahweh has said to you, you shall never return that way again. And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away. Nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law, approved by the Levitical priests. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear Yahweh his God by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes and doing them, so that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, that he may not turn aside from the commandment, either to the right hand or the left, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel." Now, I chose this passage to highlight the fact that as the people of God, as the community of the people of God, Israel is supposed to be different. And they're to acknowledge that supremacy of God in this way, that they have a mission to play. So you notice that this is what's known as the law of the king in Deuteronomy 17. This is unlike any other law in the ancient Near Eastern world. There's no law like it in the law codes of the ancient Near Eastern world. In fact, there's an Old Testament scholar named Bernard Levinson who teaches at the University of Minnesota, who says that the roots of limited government are not found in the Magna Carta, they're found in Deuteronomy 17. And he's a Jewish scholar who says that limited government is found in Deuteronomy 17 for the very first time in recorded human history. It's the only law from the ancient Near Eastern world that puts limits on the power of the king. And in fact, it denies to the king all the things that ancient Near Eastern kings did, and in fact would probably be desirable for them to do. So it says, must not acquire many horses for himself. That's not just so they can go out riding. It's not to build a huge chariot force. In other words, saying this king, this Israelite king, is not to put their trust in the military strategies of the world around them by building up a large chariot force. By the way, this explains, I think, why in 2 Samuel, is it 2 Samuel 7? I might not have that reference right, but David captures some of Saul's horses, and he hamstrings the horses, which seems cruel to us, but it also doesn't make sense militarily. Why would you give up an asset like that, a military asset? We've heard the stories of the war in Ukraine and how the Ukrainians the Ukrainian farmers are towing away Russian tanks. They're not, they're keeping them for themselves. And it's said that Ukrainian farmers now have the third largest tank battalions in the world. And so you don't get rid of a military asset like that. And yet that's what God commands. He says you don't multiply horses for yourself. Then he says you don't acquire many wives for yourself. This is referring to the practice of strategic diplomatic intermarriage, where as a power strategy, kings would seek to intermarry with more powerful nations in order to curry favor with that nation. Or somebody might, a king might marry their daughter off to somebody in a certain country to keep them loyal. So diplomatic intermarriage was a part of the practice of the world. And God, through Moses here, says, no, Israelites don't do that. You don't acquire excessive silver and gold. You don't have a huge royal treasury. And again, that's not just so that they can, be doing whatever they're doing with their wealth, it's so that they're not having a huge royal treasury that would allow them to hire mercenary soldiers, for example, or to buy off to pay tribute to foreign leaders who are threatening them, or something like that. All of this points to the idea that the people of God, Israel, are the people of Yahweh. Because the alternative to all those things, a big military, strategic diplomatic intermarriage, a huge royal treasury, is to trust in God. And that's exactly what the Israelites are called to do. So they're going to be radically countercultural in the world in terms of how they're going to live out their lives. And they are to put their trust in God. In fact, the only positive thing that an Israelite king is commanded to do is what? Be a student of Torah. Doesn't sound very fun from an ancient Near Eastern perspective to be an Israelite king, right? Compared to what some of the others. Now, by the way, let's be clear, none of the kings of Israel did this. They were terrible at this. And people wanted kings to be like the nations around them and all this sort of thing. But this is what God establishes as the ideal, that the people of God, the people of God are the people of Yahweh. They put their trust in Him in every aspect, whether it's their own personal salvation, that is dealing with their sin, or on a national level to how they deal with external threats. And so this is what Moses is calling the Israelites to, as they're on the back door, on the verge of the promised land, to live in a way that's very, very different. And so the last couple of minutes, we'll talk about how we do for time. The church is the people of God. The church is the people of God. This call to live a life of radical trust because of the fact that we are the people of God extends to us today. This is not an Old Testament thing that we can say, well, that was for Moses back in those days. This is true for us today as well. And so we are called, like the ancient Israelites, to structure our lives in such a way as we demonstrate that we are people who recognize the mission that God has called us to. Now, we don't need any convincing that missions is an important part of what the people of God are supposed to do. We have a mission. It's the continuation of the mission that God through Moses gave to the Israelites, to be a witness to a watching world of what it means to be in relationship with God. And that's not just about going and telling people about Jesus. That's part of it. That's an important part of it. Remember we talked about Ruth, and Naomi certainly talked to her about who Yahweh is. But presumably she also served as an example. And Israel as a nation was to be an example. Now in Jesus' redefinition of the people of God, he doesn't establish a new nation. Right? That's the one thing that's sort of left out. There's no political identification of the people of God after Jesus. And so the church, which is not a political entity, is to be that focus of witness for the sake of that. So the church has to be different from the world and has to be an example to the nations of what that means. And of course the church is made up of people, followers of Jesus. And so the challenge, I think, is for us to ask ourselves, how does God want us to live in a radically countercultural way, to live out the fact that we are the people of God? This church is one manifestation of that. But how does this church do that? How does the church more broadly do that? And how do we as individuals live as the people of God, to say we are different because of our relationship with God? And that's our calling. And that's what Moses says is what's going to allow the people to succeed at being the people of God. And nothing has changed since Moses' day to today. That's what's going to allow us to succeed at being the people of God. Okay, I know we've gone fast and furious. We've got like a minute left, or maybe I'm moving over time. Questions or comments that you want to make? All right, well, not hearing any questions. I know we did go very, very quickly through that. Thanks for being here, for your work today, and look forward to seeing you for our final time next Sunday. God bless you. Have a great day.